Neville knows it all. One morning, Neville woke up with Thomas, Edward, Rosie and Emily asleep in the sheds. Neville had a delivery to take to Sodor, but it was going to be a big surprise. Neville got on the turntable and he spun around and then puffed backwards. He puffed backwards and then Neville knew where he was going. He was off to the docks to take a delivery, and there was Torindo Just. The delivery was that Neville's going to get a new tender. He's going to get a new tender to try out. Torindo Just, he said, I'm getting a new tender today for me to try out. Would you take my old one in a siding? Sure, said Torindo Just. Then Neville's driver uncoupled Neville's tender, and Torindo Just lifted his tender onto a siding, and then he turned around and his hook gave him the new tender. At last, Torindo Just and Neville were done with the old tender and the new tender, and Neville's new delivery was the new tender. His driver coupled him. His driver coupled him to the new tender, and Neville chucked away into the shed. He was showing it off with pride, and everyone thought he was useful. Who's that? Said Emily. That's Neville in his new tender, said Rosie. My, doesn't he look good? Said Thomas and Edward. And he did look good, when suddenly his new tender was starting to make the balance of the turntable upset, and he couldn't fit in his old shed. It's not fair, said Neville. Now looks like I'm going to have to scrap myself. You can't do that, said Emily. You're a really useful engine. Not anymore, said Neville, and puffed crossly away. It's not fair. I want my sheds back. Why won't my tender fit through? Sorry, said Thomas. Looks like Percy's going to have to sleep in your berth. What? Said Neville. Percy? But he's not part of the sheds. Is too, said Molly. Said Emily. Is not, said Neville. Is too, is not, is too. Quiet, both of you, said Thomas, and let Percy through. And so the engines did. Percy went on to the turntable and took Neville's place at the sheds. Neville was cross. Oh, he said, I gotta change my tender. It's the only way. Go ahead, said Emily. And then Neville shoved away back to the docks. Can I have my tender back now? No, said Torindo Just. But stupid Percy has took my favourite place at the sheds. If you don't give me it back right now, I'll be in the scrapyards and Percy will live in my shed forever, he said. All right, said Torine. Then Torindo Just got rid of. Then Torindo Just, however, got rid of the new tender, put it in the dumpsters, and Neville has got his old tender back. Thank you, he said. Now it's time for me to teach Percy a lesson. You go ahead, said Torindo Just. Nice knowing you, mate, he said. You helps, said Torine. And Neville was ready. Right, he said. Get out of the sheds. I'm fit to be seen. Good luck, Percy. I owe you some money. Percy was cross. It's not fair. Neville stinks, he said. And Percy got out of Neville's shed and ran away back to his own. And Neville was finally happy to be back in his old shed again at the shed. And the engines, like Thomas, Edward, Rosie and Emily, will always like Neville inside the sheds forever. And Neville has finally got his old shed back, and he will always live in the sheds forever. And as for Percy, he ruined everything that once belonged to Neville. And Neville is happy to have his old tender back, and he's happy to be back in the sheds. Neville liked his shed and was happy to be back in it, and he was happy to have his old tender back. He realized that he knows it all, except for Percy. He was a really silly fool to go in the sheds. The engines were happy, and Neville was welcomed back, and Neville was happy to be back in the sheds. He didn't enjoy it much when Percy went in his spot, but he was happy to be back though. And Neville is now on a very happy engine.